presenters flying on the Soyuz was Dennis Tito, who was an American engineer, businessman, and entrepreneur. And it's reported that he had to pay about $20 million for the opportunity to go to space. And there was a lot of drama around his flight too. Some very senior NASA officials at the time did not want regular folks to have the chance to go on the space station without NASA training them, approving them, certifying them, and so forth. So there were tales that there had been discussions, well, if he does launch, we shouldn't let him into the US part of the space station. And during training, he was not even allowed to come on to the Johnson Space Center to complete his space station training. But those issues were resolved, and in the end, he had a very safe and successful mission. About that same time, we were starting to see some brand new entrepreneurial companies start up with a different vision about commercial space and how it should be done. In the year 2000, Blue Origin was established. In 2002, SpaceX was formed. In 2004, Scaled Composites won the Ansari X Prize for the first non-government group to take people up to 100 kilometers and back twice in 2 weeks. And Virgin Galactic was formed that same year. Now, at the beginning, there was a lot of skepticism and criticism about those new companies. I mean, you can have a Silicon Valley startup write a computer game, but space is hard, and it's expensive, and you can't build a rocket in your garage, so how could these companies do anything? So there was some pushback from established aerospace companies and from the US government at the Department of Defense and at NASA. But as we went forward, yes, there were some issues, there were some challenges, but there was significant progress being made at an amazing rate of speed. And gradually, people began to see potential benefits of having a more commercial way of flying to space. And they included things like lower cost, increased innovation, a greater risk tolerance, an opportunity for new products, new services, and customers. That's not the job of government, but that's what business does. And of finding new sources of funding and investment, so we don't have to use tax dollars and congressional appropriations to fund the next launch. It's whoever wants to buy the tickets. If you just look at the last 14 months, since July of 2021, there has been remarkable progress, especially for human spaceflight and space tourists, if you will. Virgin Galactic has had a flight with 3 tourists. Blue Origin, 6 flights, 31 tourists. SpaceX, 2 flights with 7 tourists. Space Adventures with the Soyuz rocket, 1 flight with 2 tourists. Altogether, 10 flights and 43 people just in the last 14 months. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. Let's talk about a few of those. So, July 11, 2021, Sir Richard Branson flew on Spaceship Two with 2 non-professional astronauts who were Virgin Galactic employees, and they got a chance to go to space. Just a few days later, on July 20th, Jeff Bezos flew on his company's rocket, the New Shepard, along with his brother Mark, and a couple of other folks. We had Orville Daman, and he got the record for the youngest person to ever fly to space, only 18 years old. And we had Wally Funk, a well-known woman aviator, who had the record for the oldest person to ever travel to space, 82 years old. Now that record didn't last too long, because just a few months later, William Shatner, also known as Captain Kirk from Star Trek, flew on the same rocket, and he is 90 years old, and he did just fine. In September, Jared Isaacman got a deal with SpaceX to buy a whole mission called Inspiration 4, and that was the first flight to orbit that didn't have any professional astronauts at all during the flight. He took along 3 others, including Haley Arsenault, who was a childhood cancer survivor who works as a physician assistant at St. Jude's Children's Hospital. Oh, and along the way, they raised over $200 million for St. Jude's Hospital as part of the promotion for that flight. So really great. In April, Axiom had a mission with SpaceX to fly to the International Space Station as part of NASA's private astronaut program. Michael Lopez Alegria, a former NASA astronaut who now works for Axiom, took along 3 paying passengers for a number of days on the ISS. And after a 9-year gap, Space Adventures got back with the Russian space program and flew 2 Japanese space tourists. How about looking ahead now? Boeing is working on their Starliner capsule. It's already had 2 unmanned missions, and the first flight with NASA astronauts to go to the space station is planned for February. If that goes well, they have indicated they'd like to fly a space tourist customer anytime they have an empty seat in its future trips to the space station. Sierra Space is building the Dream Chaser. They already have a NASA contract to fly cargo to the space station. They'll have their first flight in the next 1 to 2 years. And they have, from the very beginning, designed this to carry people and talked about their desire to have individuals, other countries, even maybe the United Nations, be part of the crew and carry out experiments in space. So it's really nice to have a place to live and work in low Earth orbit, and for the last 20 years that's been the International Space Station, but it's not going to last forever. NASA and the partners hope it will make it to 2030, but what happens after that? Well, they've already decided they're not going to build another government space station. Instead, they will rely on a commercial space station, or maybe multiple commercial space stations. So right now, there are 4 teams working with NASA to come up with designs and hopefully have something in place by the time the ISS is retired in 2030. One of those teams involves Blue Origin and Sierra Space. They have a concept shown here. It's called Orbital Reef, and they're viewing this like a business park. You have part of the station to do scientific research, part of the station to do commercial space manufacturing, and then part of the station is like a space hotel, where a space tourist or anybody else who just wants to get away from the Earth for a while could spend some time. Meanwhile, SpaceX is working on Starship, a huge rocket that's going to be very important in going to the moon and onto Mars. That is big. The volume inside is bigger than an Airbus 380. So if the testing goes well, if they prove this vehicle out, what could that mean if you were able to put 100, 200, 300 seats in that in terms of access to space for the rest of us? It's just amazing to think about. We talked about Jared Isaacman. When he came back from his Inspiration 4 mission, he went back to SpaceX and said, I'd like 3 more missions, please. 2 will be on the Falcon 9 and Dragon, and 1 on Starship. The next one on the Dragon, probably the end of this year, and on that flight we may well see the first spacewalk ever by a non-professional astronaut. And then there'll be another flight on Dragon, and then the first human flight on Starship is going to be with this team from Polaris that Jared Isaacman has put together. Very exciting stuff. After the vehicle is checked out, Yosaku Maezawa, who was the Japanese tourist who flew on that recent Soyuz mission, he's bought an entire Starship flight to fly around the moon, not to land, on the Starship, and he'd like to offer 8 other seats. Originally talked about having some of his artist colleagues fly, and now he's opening it up to other interested parties. So we're already seeing customers for this type of a mission. What if you think, well, it'd be really neat to see the Earth, but I can't afford the tickets right now. And besides, it's loud and it's vibration and acceleration. I'm not so sure about riding on top of a rocket. We've got an alternative for you. There are companies like Worldview that have very, very high altitude balloons. It doesn't go to space, but at 100,000 feet, it looks pretty neat. And in addition to being cheaper than the suborbital rocket flights, you can be sitting there as you gently climb up to altitude, look around for a few hours, and then gently come down to Earth. And oh, by the way, there's a restroom and a bar on board, so a few attractions. Whether you are planning to go to space or not, today there are opportunities to experience human spaceflight training in a way that it used to only be for NASA astronauts. Right now, if you want, you can buy a ticket to fly on a parabolic aircraft flight that goes up and down and experience weightlessness for 20 seconds at a time to see what that feels like. You can ride in a centrifuge, get pushed back in your seat 3Gs, 5Gs, more to see what that feels like. You can be in an altitude chamber with an oxygen mask on and experience a rapid decompression and find out what your symptoms will be if there's a sudden loss of oxygen so that you can recognize those symptoms and hopefully be safer if and when you do go to space. Or you can get some practice trying on a spacesuit and see what it would be like to do a spacewalk. So lots of great opportunities. So that just leaves one question. So what would it be like to be a space tourist? What would it be like to go to space if it was not your job? Well, after 50 years supporting our space programs in the Air Force, at NASA, at the Federal Aviation Administration, in the private industry, 6 months ago, on March 31st, I had the chance to ride on the Blue Origin New Shepard rocket up to the edge of space and back down, and it was awesome. It was a dream come true for me. I flew with 5 other people because this rocket is completely autonomous. We didn't need a pilot. We didn't need a pilot on the ground. The computer is flying the system. So that means you can really streamline the training. We had 3 full days of training, mostly on emergency procedures. What do you do if there's smoke or fire or you need to make an emergency egress? And dozens of practice runs in the simulator. And then we were ready to go. We went out to the launch pad just a few minutes before launch, saw the rocket standing there in the pad, fully fueled, climbed up the stairs, strapped into our vehicle, 3, 2, 1, ignition, liftoff. We were pushed back in our seats with about 3 Gs of acceleration. After a minute, maximum dynamic pressure, or max Q. After about 2 minutes, main engine cut off, and a few seconds later, bang! The capsule separated from the booster, and then we could unstrap our harnesses and experience the magic of weightlessness, and it is just such a joyous sensation. It is remarkable. So there was time for a few somersaults and just enjoying 3-dimensional freedom, and then we all turned to look out the window. Because the high point of this flight, at least for me, was the view. They had huge windows, and you could see the curvature of the Earth, and that thin blue line that is the atmosphere, and you're above it, and then you look at the sky, and it's not blue. It is black, blacker than you can imagine. And the whole view is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen in my whole life. It just gives me goosebumps to talk about it. It is such an emotional experience. We had about 3 minutes of weightlessness and had to get back in our seats. The capsule started coming back into the atmosphere. Once again, we're pushed back in our seats, this time with about 5.5 Gs. That's a lot, but it only lasted a few seconds, so not too uncomfortable. And then the parachutes come out, and a nice smooth ride down to the touchdown, which was very comfortable. It took about 10 minutes for the cars to get out to us. They opened the hatch, got to wave and greet our families. It was a truly amazing experience. And so going forward, let me just tell you, flying in space is incredible. It's awesome. It is wonderful. And our goal should be to see what we need to do to allow everyone who wants to have that experience. I thank you for your attention.